Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now on our 18th episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Five for Breakfast. Congress is back in session following a 2-week recess. The House Republicans are marking up the reconciliation package starting yesterday, and with the aim to complete the process by Memorial Day. Today at 10 a.m., the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will consider a series of nominations and legislation, including the nomination of Olivia Trusty from Maryland to be a member of the or commissioner at the FCC. At the same time, the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will be holding a hearing titled Global Networks at Risk, Securing the Future of Telecommunications Infrastructure. And at the FCC, the Fiber Broadband Association says we've submitted our reply comments for the FCC's delete proceeding. And also CTIA filed a petition for rulemaking asking the FCC to revise the agency's National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA rules. The FCC is seeking public comment on the petition with the first round of comments due Wednesday the 30th. And FBA is planning to submit comments. As the Fiber Broadband Association works its way around North America, so far our regional Fiber Connect workshops in San Antonio and Philadelphia have been sold out. And our annual conference, Fiber Connect 2025 in Nashville, June 1st through 4th, is on track for record attendance. And then after Fiber Connect, we will be in Anchorage in July, Toronto in August, Spokane in September, Scottsdale in October, Kansas City in November, and we'll wrap the year up with our premier member meeting in Palm Springs, California, December 8th and 9th. That brings us to today's Five for Breakfast session. Our guest today is Jaimie Lenderman, my favorite Montanian, research manager for Omdia, to discuss navigating tariff turbulence, implications for the fiber to the premise broadband access equipment market. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, as participants, please keep in mind you are in listen-only mode. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located in the lower left-hand side of your screen, and we will address those questions during our Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to respond. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will hand things back over to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Well, thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was Eric Frederick, the Chief Connectivity Officer for the Michigan High-Speed Internet Office, who discussed From Access to Impact, a major push to close the digital divide across Michigan. Eric showed us plans on how they plan to connect 248,000 unserved and underserved locations, which includes all 83 counties across the state of Michigan. If you missed last week's session, you can go to the Fiber Broadband Association's website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Jaimie Lenderman, Research Manager at Omdia, who's going to discuss navigating tariff turbulence, implications for the fiber to the premise broadband access equipment market. Jaimie is a research manager and principal analyst at Omdia, overseeing the Broadband Access Intelligence Service. She provides insights to key audiences and ecosystem players. Her publications include quarterly market share trackers, forecasting and next generation technology analysis, and business strategy, and specializing in consultant projects. She frequently participates in industry conferences and events around the world. Jaimie's research includes fiber, copper, cable, fixed wireless, and she has worked in the telecom industry for over 7 years. Jaimie's research findings and thought leadership have been published and in key findings for prominent regulatory bodies, including the FCC and in the EU. She's based in southwestern Montana. So with all that, welcome, Jaimie. And for our audience, please type in your questions to go, and I'll hand things over to Jaimie to get things kicked off.
All right. Hi, Gary. Thank you so much for having me on today. It's very kind of you to say I'm your favorite Montanan. So there's a few of us. So thank you so much for having me on today. I will, I guess, start with a disclaimer that I am not a U.S. trade policy expert. But what I've tried to do is sort of take a look at how the effect over the last few weeks of the tariffs have had an effect on our little market, our little corner of the world on the broadband access market. And so with that, I'll go to the next slide, please. So what is our assessment of the current situation? Well, it's a fluid situation, I think, is the best thing that I can say, from the get-go. At this current moment, I would say when we first started doing this analysis, that was the first week of April. Since now we're April 28th, 29th. And so we're sitting in a different position than we were when we originally took a look at this. However, we are seeing right now, while tariffs for imports from some countries have been lowered, we have seen that tariff rates for Chinese imports are increased at this time. And even with that, tariffs are still much higher compared to past levels if we're going to take a look historically, which we do believe may have some direct but also some indirect consequences for the fiber to the premise broadband access equipment market. Overall, we do see that even if there continues to be some retractions or the tariffs don't end up going through, we still believe that there will be a lingering feeling of uncertainty that is likely to persist in the market for some time. Overall, though, however, we do see that the fiber broadband access equipment market is less likely to see impact from tariffs than many other sectors that are being discussed right now. Nevertheless, in the U.S., there is potential for operators to potentially cover fewer premises passed in the case of tariffs, and we'll go into detail about that. And then the general implication is the fact that on a regional level, it's pretty diversified, the vendors that are playing in each region. And so the general impact is pretty limited because of that. And so moving to the next slide, I thought we could take a look at the supply side on the US market. And so the potential effects on the vendors serving the US market. And this, of course, this figure on the right, I've borrowed from the NTIA, where they have shown how many broadband vendors have increasingly been focusing on opportunities in the US, in large part spurred by BEAD, the Broadband Equity and Development Program. The BEAD funding obviously comes with strict Build America, Buy America compliance requirements, which I know many people on this call know much about. But essentially, it means eligible equipment must be manufactured or assembled in the US or contain a required percentage of US-made components. So in response, as you can see in the figure on the right, over the last few years, we've seen many broadband access equipment vendors that serve US clients have shifted key production lines to the US. And so some of these vendors have shifted all of their production to the US from overseas, or they were already manufacturing equipment in the United States, so they've continued to invest in that. Or additionally, there's sort of a third category where some vendors have just moved enough manufacturing capacity to meet the needs of the US market. And so, however, despite all of this, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing talked about a lot is still many subcomponents need to be imported. And I think the biggest question is a lot of those still need to be imported from China. And so what are the implications on that? We do believe we will see an increase in overall equipment pricing. And then additionally, we do believe that it's introduced some supply chain uncertainties tied to these either forthcoming trade policy changes or tariff increases. And so how is that going to affect potential builds down the road? So if we take a look at the demand side, And so taking a look at where, from the vendor perspective, we know that there's some higher manufacturing costs associated with moving manufacturing over to the US. And so what we're sort of seeing here is there an overall trickle-down effect that can not only go from the vendors, but to the operators and then potentially to the subscribers. So the higher costs associated with BABA, higher pricing due to imported subcomponents. So what does that look like? We're seeing, what I'm seeing, which is very interesting, Gary, is that some vendors are not passing on any costs associated with the tariffs. Some are choosing to do a certain percentage, and some are choosing to push all of it onto the operator or buyers. There's really no blanket model for how this is being implemented. Some will only not implement it until their inventory is depleted, and then when they're bringing in new inventory, they'll go ahead and apply tariff increases. So we're seeing a lot of different messages across the board from different vendors on what they're deciding to do. And additionally, we also know that this could potentially have CapEx implications for operators. We know that fiber to the prem investment is very long-term in nature. We see the effects by service providers could include postponing imminent projects until there's better visibility on how the likely outlook is going to go. There could be a scale back or delay CapEx for future builds and or upgrades. And then additionally, it could be spend the same amount of CapEx that's been allocated, but cover fewer premises due to cost increases. And then additionally, pass on those costs to subscribers in the form of higher retail prices. And I think the biggest thing we're talking about here in particular is equipment. But if we talk about what makes up 70 to 80% of the build is the actual capital expenditures related to civil construction costs. So the trenching, machinery, all of the different things that come down, and what is associated with that is also the cost of labor. And so first we see that machinery costs could rise, although particularly tariffs could impact the price of imported construction equipment. OLT, small components, yes, they may go up, a few dollars here and there, but it only represents a small percentage of what it would be per premises passed. But the cost could also increase once you extrapolate that to be thousands of homes. And also in the longer run, I think one thing that I'm really not seeing discussed is that the potential implications on labor costs could also increase. This could be as workers demand higher wages to compensate for broader economic effects, whether that be inflation or tariffs on goods and consumer services. So this is really, taking a look at the vendor side and the operator side and down all the way to the consumer side is what we sort of see as a worst case scenario. What could be the trickle down effects here? Now, we definitely see it being somewhere in the middle of all of this. I would say we felt differently a few weeks ago, but from what we're seeing, and the way things are developing, it seems that we're going to end up sort of somewhere in the middle with where all of this is going to go. I think right now with some operators that are so they are honed in on that costs are going up, and I'd be skeptical if they would pass the cost on to their subscribers. But in the worst case scenario, I mean, that could be a possibility. Vendors, it may also not pass on all of the costs to the operators. But there's definitely going to be some shifts. And in the short term, I think we're going to see a little bit of a slowdown while we get some more clarity on what's going to happen moving forward. And so with that, Gary, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions. We can go into conversation.
Yeah, well, so really interesting, Jaimie. I mean, to me, the challenge is how do you isolate tariffs from everything else happening? Because, we've seen the BEAD program now going to be delayed a half a year at least. And, with interest rates not going, not coming down, and, tariffs and other costs. Like, for example, my daughter is going to buy a baby stroller, and even though it's in stock, the price went up $300 overnight because of tariffs, right. Even though that wasn't, what they have in inventory wasn't really impacted by the tariffs. And I think one of the things you point out is labor is the big, the long pole in the tent here. And, depending on whether it's aerial or buried, labor is, basically 2/3 to 3/4 of the cost of a project. But there is going to be impact on fiber equipment. So how do you see that impacting, like on cars? We saw a lot of people run out and try to buy cars really quick before the tariff impact. Do you see that how this is going to impact inventories, or you think that providers will be waiting to see what happens on where tariffs going to go and kind of wait, so it's a slowdown on inventory? Or
I think, for the first part of the question, is there going to be a rush on supply? We're starting to see our first quarter vendor numbers come in. It'll be interesting what sort of story that tells, or if we're going to, if there was a big surge to purchase in the first quarter, some optical equipment, and we'll be able to have more answers as soon as we see that come in. I do suspect that there was some inventory buying in order to get the prices, pre-tariff prices. I think secondly, with regards to labor, I think one thing conversation that I have a lot is these group of workers. They do wireless project, they do fiber projects, and they have to be lined up ready to go a year in advance. It's stacked in there. And what happens is, sort of what we saw as the 5G builds were winding down a little bit, is if there was an immediate build starting to happen for fiber, there was a lot of furloughs happening. And it takes a lot of time to get these workers rehired where they need to be, get the equipment timed where it needs to be. And so I think there's just a lot of logistical maneuvering that happens anyways in this industry, that all of a sudden when you increase prices, the tariffs have an implication on the prices. And if there's an implication on the labor and moving people around, whether indirect consequences of the tariffs, I think there's a lot of different things that are going to continue to impact this aspect of the market.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. A lot of our members who have awards in Louisiana, for example, they've been up on the Hill talking to Congress saying their employees are washing trucks rather than deploying fiber because they're still waiting on a green flag for Louisiana to start their, BEAD build. And so you're saying that even as the labor, not only the inefficiency of, not knowing when these builds are starting, but with the tariffs that the cost of living is going to go up, and we're going to probably see higher labor costs from just overall cost of living. Is that?
That's what I suspect. We're already starting to see sort of the implications of some of those costs going up. And I think from an equipment standpoint, yes, a port may only go up a couple dollars, but you extrapolate that across thousands of ports, and then you're talking about cabinets or your other enclosures or different things. If the price of metals goes up, it has a trickle down effect to everything. And I think the biggest thing is going to see how different types of vendors respond in terms of whether they absorb those costs in order, or whether they pass the costs on, and how much they do pass on. And then additionally, how much operators are factoring in as well, the cost of the CapEx, the cost to build. like you said, the interest rates. I think there's a lot they're juggling right now to try to make those decisions in real time while things are happening in real time. And I think it's probably a really big struggle right now. But at the same time, a consumer at the end doesn't want their monthly bill to go up due to this, because that's going to sort of full cycle, right? Because if the cost goes up of broadband and the cost goes up of other goods, I mean, there's going to be the demand for higher wages at some point.
Well, I mean, the good news is that fiber, from a consumer's perspective, is the lowest cost broadband on the market on a cost per megabit basis.
And the operating costs, are exactly. So the operating costs remain low. And so I don't foresee service providers passing on the cost to their consumers. But I can see vendors in some capacity potentially passing the cost on to operators.
Now, what I'm hearing from our vendors, our membership, their management team is so focused on tariffs, they're not being able to spend time on working on Q2 and other things, other priorities. So how would you rank the distraction factor of having to analyze your entire supply chain and trying to figure out what's subject to tariffs and not, and whether you move things without having a lot of information of how long these tariffs are going to be around, it's just long term, short term, and just what's affected.
I think it's interesting. What immediately came to mind to me was all the work that's already been done for Build America, Buy America. I feel like vendors are pretty straight and narrow for knowing what's going to be, subjected to tariffs and what meets the requirements for U.S. manufacturing. I've had a couple conversations, if we're just talking, manufacturing that's, Mexico, Canada, that a few weeks ago, there's some vendors that were looking to move their entire operation out of a country into the U.S. Because the cost was just going to be so, astronomical to continue to manufacture. But now that the cost has come down, let's say for Mexico, I believe the tariff is around 10% now. Please don't quote me on that. But they're now feeling better. Vendors are feeling better about it, so they can keep some of their assembly in the U.S., some of their manufacturing in other countries. But it's definitely, the distraction factor is at an ultimate high, I would say.
Well, in addition to tariffs, I think 44 of our members have been certified for being Build America, Buy America compliant. They moved manufacturing, spent hundreds of millions of dollars to get manufacturing in the U.S. And yet, no one knows whenever NTI is going to release, let these BEAD projects start. So, that coupled with tariffs, how is that impacting? I mean, are we starting to see factories go on furlough, and how is the vendor community responding to all these delays?
Well, I think, the vendors, the conversations I had, prior to the developments in the recent news of BEAD and the recent U.S. tariffs developments, was that they were always in a position to either to ramp up really quickly or to back down, basically manufacture based on what was needed. And so I think a lot of these factories were essentially in idle mode with manufacturing the equipment. And I do believe that there's probably a bit of that still going on. I can't comment on furloughs or anything of that nature, but I do believe that the vendors were not manufacturing until BEAD was in a situation where they could hit go essentially on the manufacturing line.
And your research shows that not all tariff impacts are on international markets are negative. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think one main thing that we took a look across our research is that about 80% of all of the ports for OLT and ONT ports manufactured, specifically that equipment, comes from vendors that are based in mainland China. And so when you're speaking with vendors, say in the Middle East, or with operators in the Middle East or in Africa, in parts of Africa where there's much more cost sensitivity, China's going to be less susceptible to some of these tariffs because of the geopolitical situation that has been developing or has developed over the last 10 years. China has been able to bring in to do domestic manufacturing for a lot of their goods that are related to broadband equipment, and so they can continue to offer lower prices in certain regions. And so for certain operators may choose, it's one thing I'm seeing is certain operators that maybe were between an operator that may be more affected by the tariffs versus an operator that's less affected and be at a lower cost. Essentially, they may go with that operator or that vendor, excuse me. So I think that there's several things going on at play. I think the vendors that are serving the U.S. market and are set up under Build America, Buy America, they've done a lot of hard work, and I think this situation could have been a lot harder for them had they already not taken those steps to move a lot of that manufacturing over here. But I do believe it could potentially, with the higher manufacturing costs, make it harder to sell to other lower income regions.
So are there positive signs you're seeing that are hearing that this is temporary and we'll be able to recover?
Yeah, I definitely have seen sort of the distraction factors there, but I think I'm definitely seeing a more of a less reactionary and more strategic response from vendors. I think that they will find a way to make all of this work. I think it's going to be, the subcomponent issue is going to continue to be, I think, top of mind. I think it's top of mind when it comes to the media as well. What is going to continue to happen from that perspective is probably the biggest unknown at this time.
So I've seen from your other reports that the volume from, traditionally the volume had all been in China, but with the ARPA and capital projects and RDOF and BEAD and all the investment in the U.S., that U.S. was going to have the lion's share of the equipment market for the next several years, I guess starting in 2026 and beyond. Is that still the view, or does the tariffs impact that, where, as you said, people that buy from China and other countries are probably lean more on China?
So the percentage of shipments, the consumption in North America for fiber broadband equipment is increasing rapidly still. We do see sort of more of an effect, and we wonder how much BEAD, any potential changes in BEAD could change this as well, is the growth of LEO and the growth of FWA. Now, I know that's just from policy changes. So if there are operators that will go, with that could affect our forecast. Secondly, sorry, Gary, the LEO, and then secondly, changes in BEAD. That was the other. So essentially one and the same is the alternative operators, alternative technologies that are out there, as well as any changes in BEAD could affect that. But we're still seeing a huge appetite for fiber broadband in the United States. Absolutely. China they are upgrading to 50G PON right now. They are ramping up, and so there are a lot of shipments, but we do expect those shipments to peak around 2030. And we still see the U.S. has a bit of a way to go into the 2030s to really reach that same fiber penetration level that China is at. So I would say North America, US has a longer runway, so to speak.
Well, certainly as we're building out 10 gig symmetric today, and we'll be doing 25 or 50 gig PONs. So the fiber networks will be continued to be upgraded with to hundreds of gigabits to terabits. So I don't think there's going to be any lessening of an appetite for more and more bandwidth and capacity.
No, not at all.
All right. Well, Jaimie, as always, I love talking with you. And as you know, my dad was born and grew up in Montana, so I might have to call you my second favorite Montanian.
That's okay.
But you're in the top two. All right. Well, we really appreciate all your research and your industry insights and expertise. And I look forward to seeing you in Nashville next month. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us and get together next Wednesday with Erin Scarborough, the Senior Vice President of Broadband Connectivity Initiatives at AT&T. And she's going to be talking about AT&T's fiber to the home expansion plans. They're going to go to 50 million homes passed by 2029. So you're not going to want to miss that. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Jaimie.